The rich get richer will perhaps nowhere in America. Is that better illustrated than the U.S. Congress?
Members effectively using insider information to enrich themselves.
They cash in on stocks using insider information.
Members of Congress should not be able to trade stocks.
Show me the money! Derek, you better yell! Show me the money!
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Have you ever wondered how some members of the US Congress have become so incredibly wealthy? They only earn $174,000 a year on average, and yet some are worth over $100 million. Today, we're going to be looking at how they invest.
You can't have Nancy Pelosi slinging NVIDIA YOLO calls right before earnings or a regulation announcement.
This kind of behavior would never be tolerated if you work on Wall Street.
Not one person has ever been popped for this.
More from them in just a moment, but first, a quick guide to investing like a politician.
Over the course of your career, has your husband ever made a stock purchase or sale based on information you've received from you?
No. Absolutely not.
Nancy Pelosi says she doesn't own any stocks. She lets her husband, Paul, do the investing. And he's done really, really well. Over the past decade, his portfolio has gained 800%. Far better than the broader stock market, which is up just 230%.
You ought to look at Nancy Pelosi and you ought to look at some of these politicians that are stone-cold crooks.
They are taking information and weaponizing it and using it to enrich themselves.
The stock trading prowess of the Pelosi family is so widely known that there is an X account called the Nancy Pelosi Stock Tracker.
What a coincidence. Nancy Pelosi's husband sold over $500,000 worth of Visa stock just weeks before the DOJ's antitrust lawsuit against that company.
The good news is that members of Congress have to report any trades over $1,000, so there are a number of ways you can copy them. For example, the investment app Autopilot has a so-called Pelosi tracker. It gained 54% last year, beating almost every single US hedge fund. Now that sounds great, but be warned, even Autopilot calls the Pelosi tracker high risk.
Don't mess with me.
The fact is, you can try to mirror politicians' investments, but you have two big disadvantages. First, members of Congress are allowed to wait up to 45 days before reporting their trades, so you'll always be lagging behind. And second, members of Congress have access to information that can affect a stock's price way before you do. Although if they use that information, that's insider trading, and that's illegal.
Not one single senator, representative, spouse of a senator or representative should be allowed to buy or sell individual stocks anytime, ever.
The internet is full of people accusing politicians of insider trading. Some even try to present some evidence.
She bought Tesla stock 2 weeks before Biden announced an EV plan.
She's a really good stockbroker.
The best trader of all time.
I would say Pelosi's actually very good at her job. I don't agree with the stock trading stuff. I mean, she gets better returns than almost every hedge fund in this city.
We've officially passed $750 million of dollars invested through our platform, and $400 million of that is actually copy trading Nancy Pelosi.
People can throw around accusations all they like, but the fact is members of Congress are very rarely prosecuted for insider trading, and everyone is innocent until proven guilty. The other fact, though, is that these people have spent almost their entire working lives earning politician money, and yet they've accumulated rock star wealth. No wonder Americans have so many questions.
Should members of Congress and their spouses be banned from trading individual stocks while serving in Congress?
No, I don't know to the second one. Because this is a free market and people, we're a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that.
Have you ever seen a person look more nervous?
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. And today we have James Fishback, who is an advisor to DOGE. We also have Mikey Taylor, a skateboarding legend turned private equity fund manager, and Greg Swenson, another fund manager. He doesn't know how to skateboard, but he is the chairman of Republicans Overseas. Welcome to the program, everybody. Mikey, if I could start with you. What makes these politicians better at picking stocks than most hedge fund managers?
Well, first, Matthew, thank you for having me. I think that is what's highlighting the frustration of the citizen and why you have 80% support for a congressional stock ban. because it is very difficult for some of our best hedge funds to beat the market. And when you see the returns that some of the politicians or their immediate family are getting, it's hard to not accuse them of insider trading. And so I would say, when you have members that are sitting on committees that are creating the policy or the regulation before it happens, and they're also able to invest in that industry, you can see how the incentive structure is off with this.
That's a nice way of putting it, Mikey. Greg, do you want to be a bit more direct about that?
Yeah, I think there's some evidence. If you look at the COVID shutdowns that were telegraphed into these committees, these congressional committees, before the rest of the world really knew how draconian the shutdowns would be. And they were, they basically were selling, either shorting or hedging their portfolio. So, and it's also surprising that some of the other branches, notably the executive branch, if you get an appointment in a Treasury Department or Commerce, or if you're an ambassador, you have to put everything in a blind trust. They're really strict about conflicts, and it's just amazing that some branches of the government are really regulated, and then the Congress and the Senate are not.
Yeah, that's right. James, Greg mentioned the insider trading scandal of 2020, just before the pandemic really hit and before the February 20th, 2020 stock market crash. A lot of Congress people were selling like crazy. What would you call that?
Well, I think that's actually not even the most egregious example. I think when you look back to the spring of 2020 and then the announcements around the Federal Reserve, there were Federal Reserve officials who made highly questionable trades. And then the policy, the ethics code was changed to more forcefully push back against that. And so I think Greg's absolutely right. We hold cabinet secretaries and Treasury officials and Fed members to a much stricter standard than we do members of Congress. And they all have access to equally material information that is yet to be public. And so what we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're simply trying to hold all members of the federal government to the same standard, which is you cannot trade, you cannot profit on inside information. It's just that simple.
But wasn't the Stock Act of 2012, Mikey, supposed to stop all of that? I just want to go through it for our viewers. The Stock Act, stop trading on congressional knowledge. It couldn't be clearer, could it? And yet, has it been any use?
Well, yeah. The problem is there's no teeth behind it. So, we just mentioned the COVID policy and how some of the people that got the information on what was coming ended up dumping stocks. And there was, I think the DOJ went after, maybe Purdue or a couple people that were maybe getting the brunt of the media headlines on it. And there was no charges ever made. So since 2012 and the Stock Act coming into play, not one person has ever been popped for this. So I would argue that no, it's not doing what the people were hoping it would do.
Exactly. Now, Greg, after the pandemic and everything settled down and there was an investigation into numerous Congress people, but nobody was prosecuted. Nobody went to prison.
Yeah, it's hard to police. Unlike insider information from a company executive, where they have things that are that are occurring pre-release to the public, that's just easier to catch. If they did a trade, 2 or 3 days before a public announcement, it's obvious. I think this is just a little dicier because or more difficult to police because you have not necessarily company specific information, but it could just be something that's macro in nature, like shutting down the economy, or if it's coming from the Fed, any sort of decisions on interest rates, which obviously affect the stock market pretty dramatically. So yeah, I think it's just one reason might be it's harder to police, and then also, the congressional people in the House and Senate, they talk a big game that they want this regulation in place, but they don't really push it, and I think maybe there's maybe for obvious reasons.
Mikey, isn't the problem that essentially they're having to regulate and police themselves? Can I just take a look at one thing that came out of the Stock Act? They were supposed to disclose and report their purchases and sales within 45 days, but if they didn't do that, they'd be hit with a fine. Can anyone here tell me how much that fine is?
The fine is $200.
Right. Not much of a disincentive, is it?
Yeah.
No, it is not. This is the lack of teeth behind it is a big challenge. The intent, like that was very, very well said, that it's difficult to find or get somebody for intent. And then the secondary part is you have a wife or a husband or immediate family. It's challenging to, I think, really lock in on somebody. And then the last one, we're dealing with politicians, right? Politicians have to make policy, and then they also have to be front facing. And, you know, I would say that's probably our biggest criticism to politicians in general, is it feels like they tell us one thing and do another, right? And so you have all of that at play right now. So even though they mention that they would like to create like if we're talking about the House, a congressional stock trading ban, I'm not sure truly that's what they want.
Absolutely. Mikey, it's a great point you raise about how politicians put it on their spouses. Let me ask each of you this question. You can keep it as short as you like. I don't think you'll need much time on it. But James, let's start with you. So Nancy Pelosi says she doesn't own any stocks, and she has never disclosed information to her husband that would affect his stock purchases. What do you make of that?
Well, it's an absolute lie. She certainly has had these conversations with him. His timing is impeccable when it comes to these trades, especially around regulation. I mean, look, you can say a coincidence here, a coincidence there, but when Nancy Pelosi's committees are approving regulations or lifting regulations that then moves the stock price 10 to 15% right afterward, that is damning evidence. And that is no coincidence. And so there's clearly something going on there. And again, the way to do this is to hold these folks to the same standard that we hold members of the executive branch. You cannot have the Treasury Secretary trading Treasury bond futures right before an auction, and you can't have Nancy Pelosi slinging NVIDIA YOLO calls right before earnings or a regulation announcement.
Well, Mickey and Greg, if you don't disagree with that, I'm going to move on to a very specific point. Let's take a look at a point that was raised in the report. And that was brought up by one of the YouTubers there. He said that Pelosi bought Tempus AI on January the 14th, and then 40 days later, it's up 300%. Now, that could happen, Greg, but what do you think? Balance of probability?
Yeah, I mean, he could have just been lucky, and I'm not suggesting that he's not a good investor, but this kind of behavior would never be tolerated, not only in the executive branch, but if you work on Wall Street. I mean, if you're an employee at a Wall Street firm, you have to get permission every time you trade anything. And typically it gets to the point where it's just not worth it. But because by the time you get the permission, the trade's already stale, it's already old. And so, you know, I think this is just a classic example. And also, if you look at Nancy Pelosi, I mean, she was probably one of the most effective speakers in the sense that she was able to keep her party together. And prior to some of this stock regulatory conversation in Congress, AOC and the rest of the squad were really aggressive about Congress people trading equities. They said they should just ban it completely. But it's amazing. Once Nancy Pelosi got the party together, kept her house in order, there was no comment from AOC or anybody else in the squad. They were kept silent.
So let's just move on to a point many viewers will find quite interesting. Is it worth trying to mirror the investments of politicians?
Okay, well, I'll start by giving a major shout out to Unusual Whales and really Gen Z as a whole that's bringing light to what the politicians are doing. On this one, even though a lot of their returns or gains are high, excuse me, I actually don't think you should track what they're doing, because when it comes to investing, there's no one size fits all. What my risk tolerance is might not be the same as another individual's. What my capacity to handle a potential loss might not be the same as someone else. So for this one, even though I get why it would be exciting to track some of these individuals, I think you really need to create a specific portfolio to yourself that lines up with your goals, your timeline, your risk tolerance, and your capacity.
Greg, would you be tempted to use a tracker?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. Partly because I don't think, I think many times it's just luck. Sometimes maybe it's inside information. But more importantly, they because they don't have to report it for 45 days, and as you pointed out, Matthew, they only pay a $200 fine, which I find hysterical. You know, you're always behind the eight ball if you're trying to trade like they are. They always will have a jump on you. So to try to replicate that, 30, 45 days behind is probably an investment loser.
That's a fair point. James, the next section of this program is going to be heavily reliant on you because you're an advisor to DOGE. And so I want to ask you about the following. Elon Musk was on the Joe Rogan show recently, and he was asked about how Congress people accumulate such wealth. Have a listen to this.
It's a lot more than insider trading.
The way they're acquiring wealth.
Correct.
And what other methods?
I mean, this is really going to get me assassinated. It's like I'm not lengthening my lifespan by explaining this stuff, to say the least. I mean, I was supposed to go back to DC. How am I going to survive? This fucker's going to kill me for sure. In fact, I do think like it's like I actually have to be careful that I don't push too hard on the corruption stuff because it's going to get me killed.
James, how serious is this threat to him?
Well, it's very serious. I mean, you see the active arson, firebombing, vandalism, and rioting around his stores. I would not be safe driving a Tesla through New York City or Washington, D.C. today, even though I own one down in Florida. And so I'm concerned about his safety. I mean, he has a security detail that rivals that of a sitting vice president. And so we should all pray for his safety. But this is just another example of a political disagreement fueling actual violence and attempted violence against an individual and their companies. And it's completely unacceptable.
He didn't really go into the other ways that Congress people do enrich themselves. Do you know what he has in mind? Anybody?
Yeah, I think the most obvious, Matthew, is you don't have to look very far. Look at Joe Biden. And he's the most famous example, but I'm sure he's not alone. But he's been enriching himself for generations. He was essentially owned by MBNA Bank, which was subsequently purchased by Bank of America, so it doesn't exist on its own anymore. But they were really looking after Joe Biden, paying for his home that he sold at a above market price, arguably, and then of course giving Hunter Biden, long before we even knew who Hunter Biden was, at age 25, fresh out of law school, giving him a really sweetheart job at a much higher salary than the top shelf law firms in Chicago and New York were offering him. So, it's been going on for a long time. Joe Biden and his family were being paid not just by friends, they were being paid by China, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Romania in the influence peddling. So I think stock trading is the least of our problems. It's the influence peddling from people like Joe Biden that proved that he was corrupt, that he was compromised.
There are also the NGO gravy train, which Musk has kind of brought to the fore, if you like. He recently boosted a tweet about that, which says, essentially, look, we're taxed, then those tax dollars pay for things like USAID. USAID pays for the NGOs, which is set up by leftists. Leftists work there, they get paid, and then they give their salaries to the Democrats. And then he goes on to say, or rather the tweet goes on to say, it's why Dems are freaking out over Trump and Elon killing USAID. It's that simple. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's no surprise, by the way, that our tax dollars are being sent to USAID. USAID is then funding projects, whether it's Sesame Street in Iraq or a transgender opera in Colombia. It's not fiction. These are real examples of where U.S. hard-earned tax dollars went. And then the salaries of those individuals and the consultants who oversee those projects. And so if USAID were just a program to send malaria vaccinations and malaria nets to parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there wouldn't be an issue, and it certainly wouldn't have spent the money that it did. But it's just become a total gravy train to fund all sorts of pet projects that are connected with politicians, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. We know Rory Stewart, the former MP over in the United Kingdom, his wife was a part of this nonprofit in Afghanistan that was teaching Afghan locals about European modern art and masterpieces. That is not a poverty reduction program. That is an art indoctrination program. And so it has to stop. It is stopping.
Mikey, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I think it says something when you poll the people and it's a 70-30 issue of support for something like DOGE. And then I think like another litmus test is how much attention the media puts towards, like, let's say in this case, ELON cutting USAID. Whenever you see the visceral reaction on that side and then the people supporting it on the other, you're typically on target. I think that's what this feels like.
That's a really good point. And just to back him up, the representative from Tennessee, Tim Burchett, well, he was asked to explain why politicians are pushing back against DOGE. Here's his explanation.
They're going to push back because you've got congressmen on both sides of the aisle that if they follow that paper trail, it's going to come back to them. You got their wife and or girlfriend that works for some agency, quasi-agency or some business. And I'll probably get primaried for saying that, but that's the truth, and we all know it. And this town's crooked as a dog's leg.
James, is that really what happens in D.C.? Congressmen and others give their wives and girlfriends jobs in this convoluted way?
Of course it happens in D.C. And, not just in D.C., but in Europe. I mean, Rory Stewart's wife was running a nonprofit called Turquoise Mountain that was being funded by USAID. His wife was running a nonprofit that was being funded by hardworking taxpayers in East Palestine and East Baltimore. We did not sign up for that. Tax dollars should be used for our vets, our bridges, our schools, and et cetera. And so there's this familial nepotism about it as well, that it's not just funding these individual people, it's also funding their networks, the family, friends, the intern who then becomes the girlfriend, who then replaces the first wife. And so it's a really messed up thing overall.
Do you think the president and DOGE, indeed his entire cabinet, including RFK Jr., who's taking on Big Pharma, Big Ag, do you think they will significantly be able to reduce the grift in Washington, James?
Absolutely. They're already doing it. Shutting down USAID is to shut down one of the largest grift operations this country has ever known. And so absolutely they're doing that. Think about it. We're just into President Trump's second term, and they are closing, they are draining, and they are eviscerating this problem.
Mikey, do you have faith things will change as a result of Trump's presidency?
Oh, I sure hope so. I think we're heading down the right track. But this is not an easy thing to fix. This has been at play for quite some time. I think another thing to point out is it's not just bringing on your girlfriend or your wife to run something. A lot of this has to do with during the campaigning of the elected official, you're searching for dollars, and the donors that end up giving you a significant amount, that's typically not for nothing. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to run a race that is actually competitive without the financing of some of these large groups. And so I think that's, we don't have time for that conversation, but that's at play as well. And I'm not sure we're close to solving that one either.
What do you think will be the main obstacles there, Mikey?
The ability to lobby and have some of the, like, let's just say Big Pharma, Big Pharma's ability to help run candidates that then create regulation for their industry, that's a weed that is very thick and very intertwined. And that's going to take a lot of time to figure out.
Greg, same question to you. Do you have faith in this administration?
Oh, I definitely do. And I think it will take, a lot of work and a lot of time, but they are going at it, break things and move quickly. And they're doing it. And I think that's what it took. Republicans have been talking about this for generations, trying to drain the swamp and reduce the administrative state. But it really takes some disruption, and that's what we're getting from Elon Musk. And that's why you're seeing the left really freak out, because it's their livelihood for the most part. And so, burning cars, it's horrendous, but it really doesn't shock me.
Yeah.
When conservatives, didn't like what was going on at Bud Light, they stopped drinking Bud Light. They didn't try to burn the factory down.
Yeah. James, just a final question. I believe it was you who is advising DOGE about getting taxpayers a sort of a refund check, if you like, that comes out of the potential savings. Tell us about that.
Yep, we're calling it the DOGE dividend. Very simply, take 20% of all that DOGE saves over the next couple of years. We think at Azoria that could be upwards of $2 trillion, which means $400 billion would be sent back to taxpayers. That's average of about $5,000 per tax-paying household in the country. It was their money to begin with. We're simply giving them a refund, and I'm proud and honored that President Trump and Elon both support our proposal, and now it's on to lawmakers in the U.S. House to get this next step going.
James Fishback, Mikey Taylor, and Greg Swenson, thank you all very much today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Till next week, goodbye.